you can think about this last part of today's class on your own, less as I need to know this stuff very much, as opposed to what I really want you to think about is, are there other ways to imagine how we are in the world? And let me just give you just a sort of, again, a broad idea. Think about the project that you're working on. I'm really asking you, to be honest with you, to solve that problem given the system that we have right now, which is the nation-state system. But you might come to the end of that and say, well, look, man, either A, there's not a way to solve this problem given the system that we have, or whatever I do to solve the problem really makes things almost as much worse as better. In other words, the system that we have is creating this outcome that sucks, and I can't get the system needs to be changed so that we don't have this bad outcome again. I'm really not going to ask you to do that, but I am going to ask you to think about that a little bit, to say, man, maybe the system that we have just is a bad system for the things that we care about today. And maybe we need to start thinking about a different system. Let me just give you, historically, there are some ways of organization of human beings that are different than the nation state that we've seen throughout history. Let me just give you just a quick rundown. This is, again, I'm more interested in just talking about sort of these big ideas. But in the past, human beings have been organized in tribes, city-states, leagues or federations. You've seen empires. Diasporas, that's a tricky one. A diaspora is where where essentially it's not a great way to put it, but my primary loyalty is not to my state. My primary loyalty is to my ethnic group. So we might talk about, say, the Jewish diaspora or the Chinese diaspora, that sort of historically, that essentially, I may be living in a different place, but I'm still, it's all about the Chinese people. It's all about the Jewish people, that kind of thing. Supranational entities, could we talk about, instead of thinking in terms of, say, France, I'm French, maybe I can think in terms of I'm European. So a supranational entity, meaning above the nation. We sort of create a brand new nation out of this. Religious movements and institutions. Probably the most common way we think about this today would be, say, global Islam, where there's this push for Sharia law in a bunch of places, and that I'm more loyal to my religion than I am to my state. That's a tricky one for Christians. I'll give you that, just because we happen to live in a state where Christianity isn't as persecuted, and so there's this sort of sense in which, I don't have to choose between America and Christianity. But what if you did? Which would you choose? I know you want to say Christianity, but that becomes a real tricky thing there. So could we see a world in which we are organized around religious movements, religious institutions, networks, which is super messy, but maybe think in terms of like online communities? That's my primary allegiance. And here's the other one that I want you to think about, is just humanity. It's an idea called cosmopolitanism, where essentially we're organized as humanity rather than organized into teams like nation states. Like, you might ask the question, well, why are we in teams in the first place? Why aren't we all just sort of humans? And that's the way that we sort of organize. So is that a possibility into the future? In other words, the nation state's what we have right now. It's totally normal. It'd be weird if it was different for us right now, but it's really possible, in fact, probable, that that system will change at some point, because it hasn't been there in the past. The nation state is a relatively new creation, maybe in the 1700s, maybe 1800s, till today. So it's only been around a couple hundred years, which is great for us. I mean, we're in the heart of this, but it has not been the only system out here. So what is the future of the nation state? So I'm just going to ask some questions. I'm not going to have any answers for you guys. I just want to ask some questions that I want you to just think about with the system that we have right now. Is the nation state withering or weathering? And often we talk about things like things are happening in the world that are making it difficult for the system to work. Sometimes the system adapts and adjusts. Sometimes the system can't adapt and adjust. And people start asking the question, well, should we get rid of the system or not? So is the nation state less able to cope with, say, changes of globalization and technology and things like that? Or is it totally fine? It's weathering this, it's going to be fine, it's adapting. It may be a little behind, but it'll catch up and everything will be fine. We'll have the nation-state system moving on to the future. So we might ask, for example, how do we actually measure this, whether the nation-state is sort of doing all right or not doing all right? What are the characteristics? Are we sort of going into this with this bias that the nation-state's all we know, so we kind of think it's the way it should be, and so it's hard for us to sort of really understand this? What I'm really curious about here, though, is this. Is it being replaced by another dominant form of political unit? In other words, are we starting to organize into different things? Is technology like the internet or increased media connections with around the world or globalization, are these things changing the dominant political unit? You kind of saw this in one of the first readings of this class, the Castells, that a lot of you guys went, eh. We'll probably see it in one of the last readings of this class, the book by Arkabugi, where he's going to talk about, you know what, states aren't really working for humanity, they're working for states. So how do we protect human rights? What are the new forms? What might they be? You saw that list on the last page? That is not exhaustive. There could be other things we haven't thought about. Do we get to decide to replace it, or does it just happen? Do we sort of wake up one day and it's different? Like we might ask, how did the nation-state come to dominate in the first place? I'm not going to ask you guys to answer these questions, but these are things to think about, like what's coming next? Maybe we need to understand what came before and how we got to where we are today. Have global conditions sufficiently changed, making states less relevant or effective? In other words, I guess we could talk about, again, globalization. Has globalization made the state obsolete? We would say right now, no, but maybe it is moving that direction. What would a non-state system look like? In other words, what would a system that's not made up of states look like? Could we be organized into different teams? Could we be organized not into a team at all, like, say, humanity? And then, as you start working on your project, you may find good solutions with the system that we have right now. And some of you might say, well, the system sucks. Man, I gotta jump through so many hoops and do so many things I'm not happy with just to achieve this one thing, that the system itself is broke and it needs to be replaced. So what criteria should we use to judge the best global system, one that works for us? What does that even mean? Do we do it on most efficient? Do we do it on what's most just, most fair? How do we define that? Do we define it based on something that's the most good for the most people? Man, how do you define good? These are all starting to get problematic questions. How about the most good for the poorest and most disadvantaged? Like, for example, if capitalism is really kind of screwing them over, then maybe we need a different system than that. If state system is screwing people over, maybe we need something different than that. This is so super weird, but should America, so the ideas that America stand for that most of us are pretty happy with, we may not like how it gets implemented, but we like the ideas of freedom and all that, should those things sort of be the dominant things out there? What are the advantages, disadvantages of actually transitioning to a new global system? It's not going to be simple. We're not just going to sort of, move something and then one day we wake up and we're in a different sort of structure. It's going to be problematic to move from this organization to this organization. What conditions are necessary for the change to be accomplished? Like maybe these two questions make it sort of answer it in such a way that it's so difficult to do this that it's better to stick with the potentially crappy system that we know rather than go to all the trouble, all the energy, all the potentially dislodging effects to get to the thing that we want to get to. I don't know if any of this makes a lot of sense. I know it's a little sort of up in the air, and more than likely you won't be sitting around deciding this for yourself. But it is something to think about out there as you're thinking about the project, the thing that you want to see changed. If the state system's dragging it down, maybe the state system's the problem it needs to get dealt with. At the very least, what I want you to do is not just take the structure that is there for granted and say, well, that's just the way it is, I guess I have to do that. There's a level at which, yeah, you kind of have to work with the structures that you have around you, but there's also a level at which we might have to challenge some of those structures and to not be afraid to challenge the structures and not just accept them as just given. All right, there we go. I hope that was helpful and not too confusing. That's it. Thanks, guys.